All right, so Reed Johnson is an assistant professor here in the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University, where he teaches our beekeeping courses as well as researches on bee nutrition and forage, and has worked extensively on the corn dust issue with pesticides and other pesticide and toxicology projects. So I'm excited to have Reed here this morning talking about the effect of tank mix pesticide combination on bees. Reed, I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks, Denise, and good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sounds great.
Okay. So I picked a topic which is somewhat controversial, was the effects of tank mix pesticides on bees. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about this morning, we're going to talk about what tank mixes are and how bees can be exposed to them, and how that could potentially be a problem for the bees, maybe or maybe not. And as I'll show you, there's an astronomical number of combinations out there, and I'll discuss how we can try to winnow that down to find the combinations that are particularly problematic for bees, and how we can maybe exonerate a large number of the tank mix combinations, because there are legitimate reasons for a pesticide applicator to use a tank mix. It's just those combinations that are especially bad for bees that we want to be able to identify and guard against. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, honeybee hives are really repositories for every pesticide that is used in our environment. And here are three prominent papers from the United States. Mullen et al. From 2010 is probably the most famous one. Stoner and Eitzer published a nice paper in 2013, and Jeff Pettis also published a good paper in 2013. And basically, these are just catalogs of all the different insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, other chemicals that can be detected in beehive matrices. And these are the bees themselves, the pollen that bees collect, the wax that they use to construct their nest. Pretty much, if a pesticide is used in the environment, it's likely that it will be detectable in a beehive that's placed in that environment. And you could actually use a beehive as kind of an environmental sampler to figure out what kind of pollutants are available in the environment, and the beehive will serve very well in that purpose. And certainly, there are researchers who have used beehives in that way as kind of environmental samplers for the environment. But this is really just to establish the fact that bees are exposed to a lot of stuff, everything in the environment. And this is the reason that talking about pesticide combinations is really a relevant issue for bees, because if it's used in the environment, it's going to be brought back to the hive, and bees may experience different combinations of pesticide exposure. And we largely don't know what those combinations do to bees. Now, it should be stated that the highest concentration pesticides in bee colonies were and continue to be the anti-varroa treatments. Many of these anti-varroa treatments are pesticides in their own right. They are labeled as pesticides and under EPA guidance used as pesticides. And I think beekeepers need to respect that fact. And it's no surprise that these are the things that turn up in the highest concentration in beehives, because they're the ones that are directly applied to the beehives. And it's entirely possible that combinations of varroicides could have negative impacts on bee health as well, though that's not really the topic of this talk today. But I mean, it doesn't really matter where a pesticide comes from. It still has the possibility for interacting with the other pesticides that are present in that bee's environment. And a bee's environment is large. It's generally believed to be about 18,000 acres is the foraging range for a typical honeybee colony. So here's this is a Google map or Google Earth image of Worcester, Ohio, here where I'm sitting, and you can see the OSU honeybee lab there in the middle of let's see if I can. There we go. There's the OSU honeybee lab. We've got colonies over there at the bee lab, and the foraging range for those colonies is large. If any of you have ever been to Worcester, our bees here on the OARDC campus are likely foraging downtown Worcester here up into central Worcester, the College of Worcester area, as well as all this agricultural land that surrounds our town here. And it's really unknown and almost unknowable what could be applied to this large area, because you've got various homeowner applications or that could be going on here, as well as lawn care type things. And then out here you've probably got pesticides applied to agricultural crops, orchard crops, field crops, as well as more landscape type applications. It's just and presumably all of this ends up back in the beehive, where it can mix and potentially interact as the bees are bringing that stuff in and combining it with the stuff that they've stored from the weeks and potentially months before. Now, if a traditional kind of spray application is made, the bees can be exposed in many different ways. And I think I've put this slide up on previous talks I've given. But under a traditional, spray pesticide application, bees can be exposed when those pesticides land on the flowering plants that the bees visit. They could land on the bees directly, and they could drift to neighboring plants where bees pick them up, not in the field to which they are applied, but to the neighboring weedy plants that might be adjacent to the field. Systemic pesticides, not a big topic for tank mixes, but definitely a topic for bees exposure. The fact that some of these pesticides that are in use today can enter the tissues of the plant and could be available in the nectar and pollen that the bees collect, as well as through other routes of exposure. But basically, this is to say that bees can be exposed to a lot of different things through a lot of different ways, and all of this ends up back at the hive. And all of this is incredibly complicated to even begin to think about, because there's just so many different things they can be exposed to, so many different ways they can be exposed to it. It's mind-boggling, and it's difficult to get your hands around, which is kind of to introduce you to tank mixes, which are kind of an interesting subset of this combination exposure. And thankfully, it's an area of combination pesticide exposure where we can actually start to get our hands around it and begin to understand what's going on with bees. Because a tank mix is a unique combination of pesticides that is actually applied at the same time by an applicator, and they do this simply by adding more than one product to their spray tank and then apply those different products together. And this is vastly simpler than looking at the entire environment, because this is one application, and it's probably extremely relevant for the bees because they could be exposed to very high levels of whatever the constituents are in that tank mix at the same time. And this could be a real concern if there's an interaction there that's going to be bad for the bees. So this is a much simpler situation than trying to look at all the combinations that are possible out there in the environment. We're just going to focus on the tank mix, what someone is deliberately putting together and applying at the same time on the same crop. A much simpler scenario, and you should all be breathing a sigh of relief. I'm not going to talk about the dizzying complexity that's out there with all the exposures that bees receive through miticide applications, through homeowner applications, through applications in different fields, because it gives me a headache just thinking about it. Tank mix kind of still gives me a headache thinking about it, because there's a lot that could go in a tank mix too. It's still a lot of different stuff you're potentially talking about. So here on the left, we've got, they actually make, they make an app for everything now. So here's an app for your tank mixing guide from Precision Laboratories. And an app is not a bad idea, because there's a lot of different things to keep track of here. You could put herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, adjuvants, fertilizers, all into this tank mix. And it's important that things go in there in the right order, as I'll mention in a little bit. And that's the whole point of having this app. It's not anything to do with bee safety. It's all about the mechanics of pesticide application. However, and I'm going to make this point several times, there's a lot of stuff in this tank mix, but the one that beekeepers really need to be concerned about is the insecticide. Because, as everybody knows, bees are insects, and the presence of this insecticide in the tank mix is the real concern from a beekeeper's perspective. Tank mixes are not necessarily any worse than an insecticide applied by itself, but it's often, I don't know, it's somehow it gets lost in the mix here that there's an insecticide present in this tank mix. But I think in most cases, it's the insecticide that's causing the problem in these tank mixes. And that insecticide would be a problem whether it was applied in a tank mix or whether it's applied by itself. you're still applying an insecticide, and insecticides are products designed to kill insects. The bees that we care about, as everybody knows, are insects. So insecticides can be a real problem from a bee's perspective. And I think that's the biggest problem with tank mixes is you get insecticide application that may be kind of not thought about as clearly as it might have been if it was an insecticide application by itself to kill a particular pest insect. And maybe things aren't thought about as clearly as if it was an insecticide application by itself. So there are reasons to tank mix. Tank mixes aren't by themselves a bad thing. They save the applicator time because they don't have to go through the field multiple times to apply different products. They can just put them in the tank and apply them together, which saves both time and can save money because that saves on labor costs, it saves on fuel costs running the equipment through the field. And both of these are good things. I mean, it reduces the pollution that's caused by that sprayer. It reduces the greenhouse gases that are emitted when these gasoline or diesel-powered tractors go through the field. There are legitimate reasons that tank mixes can be a good thing if they are warranted in a particular situation. And in some cases, if there's a pest that's particularly tricky to control, mixing together different insecticides or different fungicides may increase the efficacy of that application in controlling a target pest, and that can improve the yield for the grower, and so that they can maybe make more money for themselves and increase their profitability, which is not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's not harming the bees in the process. However, the slippery issue with tank mixes is that they save time and money, but it might be possible, and I know this is the case in some situations, where a pesticide application occurs that would not be justifiable by itself. So a situation where you may be applying a fungicide to control a very serious pathogen for the crop you're growing. Well, you're already applying a pesticide. Why not add in a little bit of insecticide to, just in case there are any insect pests out there, we'll knock them out with the same application. It doesn't cost that much more. We're already, paying for the labor, the fuel, the equipment. Why not kill more pests with this application and maybe save ourselves a little money? And this is the problem. It may lead to these kinds of insurance applications that would not be justified on their own, but begin to maybe make sense in a tank mix situation. And this may lead to increased insecticide application. If that insecticide happens to be the insurance application of choice, there may be increased insecticide applications that would not happen outside of the context of a tank mix, and that is almost certainly bad for bees. And this is the real crux of the issue, I think, in tank mixes, is that you have insecticide applications going on that might not be justified by themselves, but in the context of a tank mix, they begin to make sense maybe on a financial basis, even if it's not justified by the pest pressure that the grower is experiencing at that time. It's more of an insurance application. So we really don't know that much about what kind of tank mixes go on out there, because there's not really a clearinghouse in most places where people are keeping track of what things are mixed together and being applied. You can survey growers, and that's certainly been done in Ohio a little bit here. That's how we know what's applied in Ohio. But the easiest place to get data, and probably the most relevant place to get data from a beekeeper's perspective, is out there in almonds, because as I'm sure anyone who's a beekeeper knows, almonds are really the 500-pound gorilla in the room in regards to beekeeping. There are 800,000 acres of almonds out there in Central Valley of California, requiring 1.5 million colonies of bees to pollinate all that almond acreage each spring. And interestingly, there are a lot of pesticides applied during bloom, potentially during bloom. Those bees are exposed to pesticides and pesticide combinations as they're pollinating these crops. And this is, of course, incredibly relevant to the beekeeping industry all across the country, because these 1.5 million colonies out there in California almonds go on to pollinate a lot of the other crops in this country, and they go on to produce a lot of the packages that the hobbyist and smaller scale beekeepers buy are actually coming out of these California almond orchards, and they were exposed to whatever they were exposed to out there in California almonds. But California almonds are a very interesting situation because we do know exactly what is applied to California almonds because the California Department of Pesticide Regulation requires recording and databasing of all pesticide applications in the state of California. And this is unique, not just in the United States, but anywhere in the world where there's this publicly accessible database of every pesticide that was applied to every acre of agricultural land in the entire state over the entire year going back almost 20 years now. It's pretty incredible. So you can actually go and look to see what was applied in almonds in a tank mix during that period when almonds were blooming. You can see what kind of insecticides were applied during bloom in almonds. And this is just a kind of a data mining experiment I did last year to see what was applied to almonds during bloom. And of the 800,000 acres of almonds, you can see that about 120 to 140,000 of those acres received some sort of insecticide application during bloom. And it was a variety of different active ingredients that those bees were exposed to during bloom. Diflubenzuron, which is a chitin synthesis inhibitor. This is not an insecticide that will kill adult bees, but could potentially harm development in bees, was the number one insecticide applied. And then you have methoxyfenazide or tebufenazide, and this is another sort of insect growth regulator. Down here in this kind of, I guess it's a chartreuse, I don't know. You have a chlorantraniliprole or flubendiamide, and this is a muscle poison. And then other insecticides and the bioinsecticides, the Bacillus thuringiensis, was also applied. So there are certainly insecticides applied during bloom in California almonds. Now, the interesting thing is, if we home in on just the diflubenzuron insecticide here, most of that diflubenzuron insecticide is applied as a tank mix. 96% of the diflubenzuron insecticide applied during bloom in California almonds was applied as a tank mix with a fungicide. And this kind of drives home the point that, you know, these almond growers probably would not be applying an insecticide if they had to apply the insecticide at this time by itself. It only makes sense to apply the insecticide if they're applying it with the fungicide. And there's a much stronger argument for applying a fungicide at this time during bloom than there is for applying the insecticide. The insecticide is honestly, in this case, kind of more of an insurance spray to control the peach twig borer, which is a serious problem in almonds, but they have other opportunities to control this, and often it's controlled with a more serious pesticide application after the petals have fallen and the bees have been moved out of almonds, is when they really control this, or potentially with a oil spray before the almonds even bloom. So the growers have lots of other opportunities to control peach twig borer. They're just taking advantage of this pesticide application, this fungicide application that needs to happen during bloom to get a little more insecticide out there to potentially increase their control of the peach twig borer. But it's not like they don't have other opportunities to do this. They're just kind of, it's an insurance spray, which may not be entirely justified if it weren't for the fungicide that they're applying at the same time. And if you look, this is a little more of my data mining. If you look at the diflubenzuron, it's tank mixed with a whole host of, the full spectrum of fungicides that are out there and are used in almonds. It's applied with all these other fungicides pretty evenly. So if there is an interaction between this diflubenzuron and one of these classes of fungicides, there's a real potential for harm to bees, either through the insecticide application by itself, or if there's some sort of nasty interaction between the insecticide and one of these fungicides, there's the potential here to really harm the bees in a way that, maybe they don't really need to be harmed because it's, do they really need to apply this insecticide at this time? So we've talked a little bit about the problems with tank mixes from the beekeeper's perspective, but if you look in the application literature, tank mixes are not without their problems from the pesticide applicator perspective. As I showed you, there's this app which could be useful in determining pesticide tank mix problems. And if you talk to applicators, physical incompatibility is a real problem because and they have these the order that you're supposed to add these different insecticides, fungicides, different products to your tank so that they don't congeal and form this kind of nasty mass of unsprayable crud, which is known as physical incompatibility, when you mix two things together and they kind of sludge out and turn into this stuff that's basically toxic waste at this point and cannot be applied to control anything. So the pesticide applicators are very concerned about this kind of physical incompatibility because they can't spray this particular combination. From a beekeeper's perspective, who cares? You know, this physical incompatibility issue, that's the applicator's problem. It really has no bearing at all on bee safety. It's just an application issue. But a lot of the stuff that's written into the label language is dealing with these physical incompatibility issues. And if you're a pesticide applicator, it's a real problem. From a beekeeper's perspective, yeah, so what? The other problem with tank mixes, if you look at the applicator literature, is this chemical incompatibility. And this is really an issue where beekeepers can become concerned. This is when the pesticide toxicity of the constituents in one of these mixes changes when you start mixing things together. And this has been well known for years and years that you can get different kinds of toxicity depending on the different kinds of things that you add into that mix. And that difference in toxicity could be relevant to bees as well. Now, there's always the possibility that you mix two things together and you actually decrease the toxicity, which would be an antagonistic interaction between the pesticides. Obviously, if you have a decrease in toxicity, maybe that's a cause for, it's certainly not a cause for concern among beekeepers. That's fine with us. Decreased toxicity, not a problem. Problems show up when you have this kind of additive toxicity. Now, and this would be a particular case where you have maybe different insecticide formulations going into the same tank mix. And I don't think this happens really often, but it could happen in some situations where you have two insecticides that are from the same class of compounds. Pyrethroids are a major class of insecticides that are out there. Maybe you have a tank mix where you're mixing two different pyrethroids together. And alone, maybe each one of these pyrethroid insecticides would be fine for bees. But when you mix them together, you get what's known as additive toxicity, because these two pyrethroids have similar modes of action, and the toxicity of this mix is going to be roughly equivalent to the additive toxicity of the two constituent ingredients. So why? While pyrethroid 1 may be fine at this level of application, pyrethroid 2 may be fine at this level of application, together they are more toxic, and that toxicity could probably be predicted by adding them together, known as additive toxicity. And this is pretty easy to watch out for because generally people know what kind of things they're applying and what kind of mode of action they probably have. Much trickier to predict are these synergistic interactions. And these are kind of unexpected leaps in toxicity that an insecticide might show when you mix a particular insecticide and a particular fungicide together. And the classic case of this kind of synergistic interaction is with the pyrethroid insecticides and the sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides. And this works because these sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides are really not toxic to bees in their own right. They're only toxic to bees when they're present with pyrethroid insecticides or potentially other insecticides because they inhibit the detoxification of that insecticide, and you can get really massive leaps in toxicity. And this has been known at least since the 1990s, and in context of bee toxicity, there's a really nice review that Helen Thompson wrote back in 2012. She looked at all the various cases where this particular synergistic interaction occurs, and this can be a real problem for bees, and it's something that applicators really should watch out. Applicators and beekeepers need to watch out for. It's pretty well validated. This synergistic interaction occurs on a widespread scale. And here's just a schematic of what's happening, and some of you may have seen my little cartoon here before. But here's a cytochrome P450 enzyme. This is a detoxification enzyme. All living things have these detoxification enzymes. This enzyme, this class of enzymes, is what allows you to drink coffee. And I'm going to drink my coffee right now. That coffee contains caffeine. Caffeine is a toxic compound, and it would be possible to poison yourself with caffeine by drinking coffee if it were not for the P450s that are active in your liver. These enzymes are down there cranking away at detoxifying the caffeine that I'm drinking. So, when the caffeine, or it could be an insecticide or whatever, it gets processed by these cytochrome P450s and is detoxified. And we owe our ability to handle a lot of the toxins and toxic compounds that we encounter because we're able to detoxify them. And it turns out bees are exactly the same, that they detoxify a lot of the insecticides and the other toxins in their environment through the cytochrome P450 activity in their midgut and in their fat body. And this allows them to tolerate, they're actually tolerant of some pesticide exposure because they just detoxify them in the same way that we detoxify caffeine in our coffee. Of course, the problem is when you have a fungicide, and these sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides are specifically designed to inhibit cytochrome P450 activity. And they will inhibit the activity of detoxification by this enzyme. So now when you add in a pesticide that the bees could previously tolerate, they can no longer detoxify that insecticide, and they will die at a much lower dose. This could be a serious problem, and this is the reason that these sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides can be a real problem in a tank mix with pyrethroid insecticides and potentially other insecticides as well. I think that it probably extends beyond just the pyrethroids. Oh, I'm sorry. I pushed the wrong button. Let me just get this presentation back up here. So sorry for stopping that on you. So basically, bees are a lot like humans and all other organisms in their ability to detoxify the things that they encounter. And if you have a tank mix combination that inhibits their ability to detoxify what they're encountering in their environment, that's going to be bad news. So I guess just to recap, here's that fungicide interacting with the P450. And then the bees can't detoxify a pesticide that maybe they previously could. So that's a good example of a case where a tank mix is likely to be problematic for bees. Can we predict which tank mixes might be a problem, might have synergistic interactions that could cause a problem for bees? Well, let's look at the universe of insecticides that are out there. And this is the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee's classification of all the insecticides that are out there. Each one of these little honeycomb-shaped hexagons is a different insecticide active ingredient. And as you can see, over the last 50 or 60 years, the chemists have been very busy coming up with new insecticidal compounds to control insect pests. So this poster contains about 130 different compounds. These 130 compounds can be classified into different groups which share a similar mode of action or a similar route that they kill the pest insect. So you can categorize them according to their mode of action or their chemistry. There's at least 130 compounds out there in active use. You look at the fungicides, and this is really the tank mix combinations we're probably most concerned with is this insecticide-fungicide combination. Again, the chemists have been very busy. Lots of different fungicides out here. This is from the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee's poster. These posters both exist because insects have become resistant to different classes of insecticides. Fungi have become resistant to different classes of fungicides. And there's a big effort to prevent or delay this evolution of resistance in these pests of these different crops. So there's a lot of categorization of these different pesticides that occurs, and the advantage is they produce these really nice posters that really allow us to visualize and understand the mode of action of all these different compounds and can really be helpful in understanding interactions that may be occurring. But again, each one of these little honeycomb-shaped things is another fungicide. At least 200 different compounds out there that bees could be exposed to, potentially in a tank mix. So this is where we really bring the problem And this is a simplified problem compared to all the toxins that bees may be encountering in the environment. This is just the toxins toxicants they may be encountering in a tank mix of an insecticide and a fungicide. We have 130 different insecticides. We have 200 different fungicides. That's only 26,000 different insecticide fungicide combinations that we need to test for and deal with. So that's much simplified from all the limitless combinations that are possible out there in the bees' environment. These are just the ones that could take place in a tank mix of an insecticide and a fungicide. But 26,000 is a lot of combinations. And honestly, to test that would probably take me at least the rest of my life, probably several lifetimes to do. But I mean, I guess it's not an impossible endeavor to test all these different combinations on just a very simple basis. Just testing, putting them together, and seeing if they kill bees. So I think that from a beekeeper's perspective, the problem with tank mixes really centers around the presence of an insecticide in that tank mix and the issue of whether that insecticide really needs to be there, which is potentially a different discussion. But if an insecticide is in a tank mix, that insecticide is likely of concern to a beekeeper. Additionally, a concern would be if that insecticide and the fungicide that it's sharing the tank mix with could cause one of these kinds of synergistic interactions where you get an unexpected leap in toxicity of that insecticide that's already present. So one way that we can get a handle on these 26,000 possible combinations is through a simple lab bioassay called an LD50. And this is really the only way that we have to get a handle if we're going to try and look at all these different possible combinations. It would just be impossible to do this on any sort of field scale. It has to be some sort of lab experiment that only takes a couple days to perform, to really screen all these different possible combinations that are out there to get some sense of which ones are of concern, which ones are probably not of concern, and we can put them lower on the priority list for worrying about. So an LD50 bioassay gives good data, and this has been the basis for pesticide regulation for the last 40 years now. And I've done a lot of these myself. You simply collect brood from a colony, age adults till 3 to 4 days old, so that they're all nice and evenly aged. Then you would apply the fungicide. This is the way I've done it in the past. You apply a fungicide at a field relevant level. Here we've got the bees. I'm applying a little bit of fungicide to them. These bees have been knocked out with CO2, so they're not flying around. You apply a little bit of fungicide to them. And then you would apply a variable doses of an insecticide. In this case, the data I'm going to show you here, we're applying tau-fluvalinate, which is actually the active ingredient in these apistan strips that the beekeepers use to control varroa mites, but you would use exactly the same process for looking at insecticide combinations with the fungicide that they're in a tank mix with. You put these in cups or containers of some kind, and in this particular case, we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different dose levels for the insecticide plus a control. Each one of these cups has 20 different bees in it that have all been treated in the same way. And you can set this up in an hour or so and can get pretty quickly get a sense for which combination, if this particular combination is going to cause an increase in toxicity relative to just the insecticide by itself. And then you come back 24 hours later, you count the number of dead bees in each of the different dose level treatments. And then you can fit that to a dose response curve. And this is just some classic toxicology here. So here the insecticide by itself, at a low dose, you get relatively low mortality. As you increase the dose, you get increasing mortality in those groups of bees, so that that little cup of bees that received the highest dose, you see almost 100% mortality. Then you can fit, using a mathematical model, you can fit a curve to this line, and then you can determine the LD50, which is the dose at which you would expect 50% of the bees to die. And we find that the LD50 for fluvalinate is right around 10 micrograms per bee, which is actually a lot. 10 micrograms is quite a bit of an insecticide. which of course is the reason that beekeepers can use these apistan strips in their hive to control veromites, because it's not very toxic to the bees. Now, however, if you apply a fungicide, and this is one of these sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides, prior to applying the insecticide, you get a substantial increase in the toxicity of that insecticide. So you've got an LD50 here of 0.01 micrograms per bee. That's about 1,000-fold less than the insecticide by itself. Now, this is a really extreme situation. We're using a very high level of fungicide here, probably higher than bees would be exposed to, in a sprayed application. But it's just to show that really profound increases in toxicity are possible with some of these interactive effects, depending on what the exposure level is and depending on how the particular compounds interact. Really great increases in toxicity, 1,000-fold, are possible, as we see in this particular combination. And this is honestly an extreme example, but just to show you what's possible. So this particular group of fungicides, and I think that it's probably a good idea to test tank mixes that are relevant in places where bees are exposed, but this particular tank mix combination, these kind of simplifies the situation. We're just looking at the sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides down here in the lower left corner on this FRAC poster. And here they are. We've limited it to a smaller subset of this massive world of fungicides. We've just got this group of 25 here that are likely to interact with the pyrethroid insecticides. But we probably should test these to see if in common tank mix combinations, if these really are causing unexpected increases in toxicity, and if that level of increased toxicity is tolerable for bees. Because honestly, nobody's tested it. I've tested it a little bit, but not to the level that we really need to see. And the issue here is that group of fungicides, probably anything that you see, any one of these little honeycomb-shaped molecules is likely to interact with the detoxification process in bees, so that any subsequent or combinatorial exposure to insecticide is not going to be detoxified by the bees like it would have been if the insecticide had been applied by itself. And here's just an example. These are all, on the left-hand side of this chart here, these are all different P450 inhibiting compounds. These bottom 5 are all different sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides. Most of them are widely used in places where bees are likely to come into contact with them. They carry no label restrictions to say that they can't be used when bees are present, because by themselves, they really are not toxic to bees. It's only in combination with some insecticides that they really synergize the toxicity of the insecticides they're combined with. And as you can see, this is taufluvalinate again, this pesticide that's used by beekeepers, but also somewhat used in agriculture. And as you increase the dose of the insecticide that the bees are exposed to, you get increasing levels of synergistic interactions. This top level large number here is the LD50 value for the fluvalinate with a low level of fungicide present, with a moderate level of fungicide present, and with a high level of fungicide present. And you can see that as you increase the amount of fungicide that the fluvalinate is co-applied with, you really get these 1,000-fold kinds of increases in toxicity that I mentioned before. So that an insecticide that is essentially bee safe when applied by itself becomes really quite dangerous to bees when it's applied in combination with fungicides. We know this is the case for a lot of these pyrethroid insecticides if they're applied in a tank mix with the fungicides. So just to conclude here, I guess the real problem is that tank mixes open the door to these kinds of insurance insecticide applications that might not be justifiable on their own, but since a large cost of the application and is already been covered by a different pesticide that might legitimately need to be applied, the marginal cost of applying this insecticide in combination is low, and that maybe leads to these kinds of insurance applications that might not be justifiable on their own. And I think that is a real problem from a beekeeper's perspective, that we've got insecticide application happening that maybe doesn't need to be happening. Most insecticides are bad for bees, whether they kill in a tank mix or not. So it's not the fact that these insecticides are being applied in a tank mix in most cases, it's the fact that insecticide is being applied. And insecticides, by and large, are not good for bees. And the less insecticide applied, the happier all beekeepers should be. There are cases, particularly with this group 3 sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides, where there are documented, and this is documented over the last 25 years, to increase the toxicity of insecticides that they're applied with. There may be other fungicide groups out there that cause similar sorts of increases in toxicity, but there hasn't been a real wide-scale level of testing of the different fungicide groups. So honestly, we don't really know. Certainly, there have been bee kill reports that could begin to guide us on which combinations could be a problem. But there's certainly the possibility that there's these unexpected leaps in toxicity because of these synergistic interactions. And we know that this group of sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides is a problem and is something that beekeepers and pesticide applicators need to watch out for. So hopefully it's a complicated topic, but not as complicated as the truly incredible range of toxic compounds that bees are exposed to in the wider environment. I think these tank mixes are really a good place to start looking for combination toxicity and its effects on bees. And at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions people have about this topic.
Great, thanks, Reed. Looks like some questions are coming in. I'll start off by asking you about new products on the horizon, maybe new groups of pesticides that might kind of complicate this picture, and just your perspective on that. Are there some new things coming, fungicides, insecticides?
Well, there are always new insecticides and fungicides under development because the pests and pathogens evolve resistance to the old ones, so there's a constant need for new active ingredients, and there's stuff in constant development that, thankfully, new insecticides in general, bee safety is a major issue for companies, and they're trying to develop insecticides that are quote-unquote bee safe. Now, this may actually exacerbate the tank mix problem, because when you've got a quote-unquote bee safe insecticide, there's a greater temptation to just mix that in with a fungicide that might be applied during bloom, and you could, have some of these kinds of synergistic interactions showing up where before the insecticide that was in use was so highly toxic to bees that they would never consider applying it in a tank mix when bees were present because the label just would not allow for that. So I think that this tank mix issue is likely to become more prominent as the insecticides that are out there in use become less acutely toxic to bees, which is kind of a paradox.
Interesting, thank you. Alan wants to know if there's a time factor for the synergy action. If tank mix fungicides and insecticides are applied at night, would the toxicity remain the same in the morning?
Well, night application is probably a good way around a lot of this issue. It depends a lot on the biology of the plant that they're being applied to. If it's an attractive flower that closes at night and new flowers open in the morning, a nighttime application of any insecticide or tank mix or whatever is really probably ideal because those new flowers opening in the morning are not going to harbor any of that insecticide or fungicide or who knows what was mixed together when those new flowers open in the morning, and the bee's exposure is hopefully going to be pretty low. Also, if the product is dried on, the bees are going to get less of a dose. And if the bees are not out there flying directly through the cloud of spray that's being applied, that's also going to limit their exposure. So timing, it's not a complicated. Certainly, these products will degrade over time, and there's a residual toxicity that has been calculated for all of them. But I think a lot of the timing of application and the real benefits of night application is just that the bees, honestly, they don't get exposed much at all, because there might be new flowers that they're visiting, and they don't get that kind of direct hit that they would get if the application was made during the day when the bees are out there working the flowers and flying through the spray cloud on their own.
Okay, I think Christine has kind of a related question. What's the timing for spraying SBI and then following up with insecticide in days? So I'm assuming she means not in a tank mix, but just separate applications?
So the fungicides, as far as bee toxicity, the fungicides, most of them have essentially no toxicity, as it's been traditionally measured on their own. So their residual toxicity is their original toxicity is essentially zero. So the residual toxicity is unmeasurable essentially with the techniques that have been used. The residual toxicity of the insecticides varies substantially, anywhere from just a few hours up to several days, depending on the product. Or if it's one of these be-safe insecticides, again, it's difficult to measure the acute toxicity, so the residual toxicity is also almost impossible to measure. So there is none. But that doesn't mean that if you apply, mix in a particular insecticide with a particular fungicide that you might not get toxicity, and we just haven't been testing for any sort of residual toxicity in these tank mixes.
Okay, Dwayne says you spoke of the relationship or synergy of one grouping of insecticides and one group of fungicides. Are there other groups that beekeepers should be concerned about?
I think beekeepers' number one concern is the insecticide. If you're going to be worried about one thing, worry about the insecticide that's in these tank mixes. Number two is going to be the presence of that group of sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides as a tank mix partner with an insecticide. And I don't think it necessarily really matters what the insecticide is. Certainly the evidence is best for the pyrethroid class of insecticides, but there have been people looking at other classes of insecticides, certainly some of the neonicotinoids. I think the assumption should be that any insecticide has the potential to be increased in toxicity if it's applied in combination with one of these sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides. It appears to be a relatively universal phenomenon. Not entirely universal, but there are certainly a lot of different insecticides that can experience this kind of increase in toxicity when applied in combination with that particular group of fungicides. So I think that's the group that people need to keep their eye on, is this sterile biosynthesis inhibiting. And you can discern these things because they carry the name Group 3 at the top of the label. The Fungicide Resistance Action Committee has assigned this group Group 3 for the reasons of preventing fungicide resistance. But they all work through a similar mode of action as P450 inhibitors. So if you see Group 3 on the label, that's the group of fungicides that beekeepers and pesticide applicators need to watch out for when applying in combination with insecticides. There are a lot of other fungicides out there. In the testing that I have done, I have yet to see any sort of substantial increase in toxicity with any other particular fungicide class. You've got, and I see, you can look through there, the strobilurins, you've got a lot of these work through inhibiting respiration in the mitochondria of the fungus, and presumably they have some effect on the bee as well. I have not seen synergistic interactions, certainly not substantial ones, that are likely to be of concern to the beekeeper. I think we need to keep our focus on, number one, the insecticides, and number two, this group of sterile biosynthesis inhibiting fungicides. And I think for the rest of the fungicides, we just need to, I guess, keep a skeptical eye on them, but I don't know that we need to really get worried about them at this point until research shows that there's a problem there, or if there's a bee kill event where we can tie these other groups of fungicides to a particular insecticide combination to really become concerned about them.
Okay, and then Bill asked a practical question. How does a backyard beekeeper know if dead bees may be subject to tank mix bee kill?
The short answer is you don't. What you would need to do in that situation would be to send those bees off to the USDA AMS lab in Gastonia, North Carolina, and they will do a pesticide screen on that bee sample. They can look for over 200 different pesticides, and many of those are the most commonly used pesticides that are the likely candidates, insecticides and fungicides that will be in a tank mix. Now, the disadvantage of sending them, well, number one, you would need to collect probably at least 30 dead bees, and you want to get them probably off the bottom board so that they're good, nice and clean and don't have a lot of other junk in them. You need to collect them quickly as soon as you see them dead, and you need to keep them in the freezer immediately after you collect them so that the insecticides and fungicides and other pesticides in there don't degrade. The disadvantage of this is that you need to pay, I believe it's $330 now for the pesticide screen. And you may be balking at $330 for a pesticide screen. That's actually a very good deal. Having done some of this analysis, it's a very labor-intensive and instrument-intensive procedure, and $330 to look at these 200 different pesticides is a good deal. Now, as a backyard beekeeper, how much do you care about this? I guess if you're a backyard beekeeper, you could ask around, see if anyone's been applying things. Or you could just take the hit and just it's not a very satisfying answer, I know. This is a really hard thing to get to the bottom of because there's a lot of combinations out there, and it's very difficult to identify what a particular batch of bees has been exposed to. And even if you do spend your $330 and send it off to North Carolina, it's not entirely... I mean, there's a possibility that even if those bees did die from a tank mix exposure, there may not be enough in those bees to really be able to say definitively what it was that killed them. So this is really a frustrating situation, I think, for beekeepers, because it's difficult to connect the exposure to any sort of bad outcome that people may be experiencing.